Hey guys, back here in the garden, and wanted to address some kind of nuts and bolts for first-time gardeners. I realized with my last video talking about what to plant, that's kind of the second step is planting. The first step is preparing. So for those of you that have gardened before, you can probably pass on this video. But those of you that are really getting started, or you're having different constraints, like you've moved to a new place, or you have certain landlord requirements, you might need to find a new way to grow your food and medicine. So there are many different methods and ideas. Personally, I like that gardening connects me to the earth, so I really like to plant things right into the ground. There's pros and cons to every way of gardening. The pro with that is that you can just go ahead and get started. You can dig up the sod if you're growing from a grass lawn. Just go ahead and take that out and compost it. You can mix in organic matter, so manure is really good. If you know anyone who boards horses, usually they'll give it to you for free or very cheap, especially if you're willing to come and haul it yourself. So getting manure is very good. Doing your own composting. If you save your leaves in the fall, if you just go ahead and, if you are someone that rakes your leaves, go ahead and save them in a pile. To get them to break down though, you really want to see if you can run the lawnmower over them, or just really kind of like have your kids jump on the pile, or you. And you want to get it into little pieces, or else the leaves will kind of stay dry and blow around and not really decompose. You want them to be dense and wet. So broken down leaves are great. Other amendments, those are the big ones I'm thinking of at this time. And then of course you can, like in the first video, I mentioned the local composting companies that deliver topsoil. Black Bear and Panorama Paid are really good. So anyway, the downside to that is that you're on ground level, so it's going to be really easy for the weeds to creep in. So that's why you got to be really on top of your mulching. Put your straw, put your dried leaves down to suppress the weeds. Also additionally, just like in our garden here, I put log barriers around the beds, and that really does, just that little bit of log really actually makes a great, I don't know if you can see it, let me see, yeah. That really makes a great barrier. So sometimes, like right here, this weed will creep underneath, but the log really does disrupt the root systems just through suppressing the sunlight. So anyway, that's one method. I love it because then you can even have little grass paths in between the beds. I just think it's really beautiful, but you're gonna have to kind of commit to the maintenance of that. It's not that bad, but yeah, that's what I like to do. With that said, a lot of people really like to do raised beds, and the advantage to that is one, the weeds stay out much better because they're not dispersing their seeds and their root systems. Also, it can keep pests away, so some animals won't go through the trouble of climbing up a couple foot high wooden edge. It can also be easier for like gardening, that you don't have to bend down as far. So those are the perks. There's a lot of them. I guess the downside would be that you have to construct it, which is not too hard. Source the materials, and it doesn't have as much of an organic look. But some people really like that kind of formal, neat look to it. So that's another great option. You can also do container gardening, and really plants will grow in anything that has drainage, as long as you give it soil, air, sun, water. So whether it's a formal, kind of like a pot, or if it is a bucket with holes drilled into the bottom of it, if it's a burlap sack, all these things can grow plants. So really get creative. There's a lot of different options. The things to watch out for are like making sure it's well drained. So then you're gonna have to keep the animals out, because especially in this area, we just have voracious animals that are gonna eat up a lot of your plants if you don't protect it. So what we've done here, let me see if I can show this, is a 2-layer method. So this really fine hardware cloth to keep the rodents out, and it's actually buried down and out 1.5 foot. So it's 1.5 foot down and 1.5 foot out, like an L shape. And that's because groundhogs will just keep going, they'll keep going, if they try to get to the fence here and they can't, they'll go down and over until they find a breach. So groundhogs, in my experience, have been the #1 pest to a garden. They're really, really difficult, and they will wipe out a whole patch, you know, in a day or two. Rabbits as well. Rabbits can also squeeze through, and as with any rodent, can squeeze through really small holes. So as long as their skull can fit through, the rest of their body and their bones can kind of, you know, condense to get through that hole. But anyway, so then you also need height. So this is some deer fencing that goes up 8 feet. And then on the top of it, we've recently installed, I don't know if you can see it, but an electric wire, because groundhogs are actually not just groundhogs. I call them groundhogs, tree hogs, everything hogs, because I've seen them 30 feet up in a mulberry tree eating the leaves, which is actually one of their spring favorites. So we have had groundhogs climb up our fence, especially if there's kind of vines and other things around it. So you need to secure the bottom, secure the top really, really, really well. Yeah, if you're gonna keep the animals out. So if you don't have a fence, you can still garden. So here are the things to garden without a really good fence. Anything in the nightshade family, so that's gonna include your tomatoes and peppers and your potatoes. With the potatoes, like I was talking about all the options with container gardening, you can grow them out of anything. So growing your potatoes, as we said in the last video, slice up a store-bought potato, put it in, keep mulching it, it's gonna keep producing potatoes as it sends off shoots from the stem that's under the ground. You can plant anything in the allium family, so onions, garlics, leek, scallions, shallots, chives, all of those oniony, garlicky things, the animals will stay away from with no fence. So that gives you a lot of veggie options right there. If you're gonna try still planting some other things, some of their favorites are the greens, including carrot tops, and then also the cucurbits, which are melons, squash, and cucumbers. So to grow those things, if you plant a green fence of alliums around that bed, so just plant a lot of little garlic cloves, it really works. We have a really healthy deer population here, and normally they would just, like, you know, demolish a patch of kale, but we did an experiment one year where we just planted really thick garlic in a ring all the way around. We actually do have a couple raised beds. So it was a raised bed, we planted garlic around the perimeter, and they didn't touch the kale, which just blew my mind because normally it would be gone overnight. So that really does work. You can also intersperse the alliums throughout the bed. And then that would be a really great opportunity to do container gardening. So to have pots like on your patio or something if you have that option. For the cucurbits, the melon, squash, and cucumbers, that I would say would be probably the most difficult to impossible thing to grow successfully if you have groundhogs, if you don't take a couple measures. So the steps to take are, one, again, grow it in a container closer to your house, but then in that case as well, and especially if you're just growing them out in your yard or in a raised bed or unprotected area, what you can do, they don't eat the leaves, they eat the fruit. And what's so aggravating is that they'll eat like one chunk, one little bite or two out of each fruit so that they all rot and you don't get any. Cucumbers would be one exception because they're so productive. I would still plant cucumbers anywhere, even without protection, because they just make they have such a high yield that you're gonna still get some cucumbers even if they eat some of the cucumbers. They can't keep up with how many cucumbers the plant produces. But with the melons and squashes, they take a really long time to mature. And as soon as they get a chunk taken out of them and they're vulnerable to fungus and bacteria, they're gonna rot. So anyway, you can make a physical barrier to them getting to the fruit. So as soon as you get like a little baby squash or melon on the vine, if you protect it in some way, you could make a wire cage around it, you could put it in a bucket, you could put it in an egg crate, a milk crate, those little plastic, cubes, that can protect it. Because we have such a healthy groundhog population that knows we have a garden here, that they're very smart, they'll figure things out, they'll find your fruit if they know it's there. We've noticed that one time I made a wire cage around all the baby fruits and they like ripped through that. So they're really fierce. So if you're gonna put something around it, make it really well secured if you're noticing they're getting through. With that said, a lot of first-time gardens are very successful the first couple years, because it takes a while for the animals to really discover, oh, whoa, there's a source of food here. So there's always gardener's beginner luck. In addition, if you're turning turf, like your grass, into a garden, there's also the beginner's luck of there's usually a lot of nutrients in the soil your first year, and then it kind of gets depleted as it gets eroded or vegetables suck up the nutrients, or if you're not replenishing enough compost. So definitely go for it. Sometimes you can have a really abundant, productive first season. So as far as planting seeds, a lot of people ask, how deep do I plant the seeds? And the answer is it just depends on the seed. But fortunately, there's a pretty easy rule of thumb, which is, in general, you plant seeds 2 to 4 times as deep as their diameter. So really small seeds like the greens, lettuce, kale, all of that, the brassicas, they tend to have very small seeds. I don't even like plant them. It's called broadcast sowing, where you just sprinkle the seeds over your prepared soil with your compost, and you've kind of fluffed it up, roughed it up a little bit. I just sprinkle them all throughout. But then what I do is I kind of go over, and it's almost like giving someone a head massage. I just kind of gently massage them into the soil, and then I tamp it down a little bit. So you're not supposed to compact the soil too much, but if you get it nice and fluffy, I will actually go put my layer of mulch, my straw as a layer of mulch on top of that, and then I'll just go kind of like do one pass, just stepping over, just walking over the whole bed to kind of tamp it down, so that when it does rain, or you do water it with the hose to get the seeds germinating, everything will be touching, so it'll kind of absorb that water and not have like huge air pockets where the seeds might not successfully germinate. So with something that's bigger, like a clove of garlic or a pumpkin seed or whatever, you're going to plant it deeper. Particularly garlic and potatoes, I would say you can plant those extra deep, because garlic is a bulb, and it can send its leaves throughout the soil pretty far. And then potatoes, as we've talked about, like the deeper it is, the more stem surface area it has to send off more potatoes from. So that's seed depth. For germinating, you're going to want to keep your seeds moist throughout that process. So whether it's like watering it regularly, again, can't reiterate enough, putting the mulch down, that's going to hold the moisture down, so you don't have to water as much and they won't dry out. But just to give a particular tip, so some seeds like the cucurbits and sunflowers and peas, they will grow whether or not you water them. They'll take their time. They'll soak up the available moisture. They'll get going when they're ready to, and they tend to grow really quickly. Greens, but even more particularly, I'm going to focus on carrots. Carrots are very finicky. I would say, in my experience, the most finicky with germination. They really want to keep consistently moist. I've had so many years I planted an entire patch of carrots, and I'm like, where are they? Why did I get 4 carrots or whatever? One is they're small and light, and they can wash out. So if you don't properly tamp the soil and mulch it, they can wash away really easily, especially because they're small, so you didn't plant them deep. But with the carrots, I noticed that even if I let them dry out for a few days, it's like once they start germinating, and if they dry out, they can die very easily. Other plants have more of an ability to retain moisture. But again, in my experience of doing this for a decade or so, carrots are the ones you want to keep moist. One trick that I picked up from Ira Wallace from Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is that if you don't want to have to water them every single day, or you do, but you just as a built-in buffer for, like, you forget, or you're busy, or whatever, something happens and you don't want to lose your whole patch of carrots. And you can do this with any seeds, not just carrots, but one trick is you can actually, after watering them really well the first time, cover them with either like a board, like a plywood board, or a nice thick layer of cardboard, or something that's gonna or even like a tarp, like plastic, and anything that's gonna kind of hold the moisture in. You can do that, and that's going to keep the moisture in, so you're barely going to have to water it. And all you have to do is check on it to make sure, once the seeds sprout, you take it off. That's the one catch, is that you do have to, every few days, check on it. They can survive a few days once they've sprouted, or even longer, maybe a week or so, without sunlight or that aeration. But eventually, once they start to grow, they're really going to need the air and the sun to not die or rot. So that's one trick. Use the board trick to keep carrots moist while they're germinating. For compost, now is a really great time, especially because a lot of us are spending more time at home, and we have this availability to sort of be more mindful with our waste, instead of being in a rush and just throwing stuff in the trash or whatever. With composting, the biggest rules of thumb for me are you really want to alternate all of your fresh stuff, all of your input like your veggie scraps and fruit and things like that, with what they call browns, which doesn't have to be brown but tends to be dried leaves, straw, things that are sort of just like a carbon source to balance out all the nitrogen from the fresh food scraps. So if you put all fresh food scraps, it's gonna turn into anaerobic fermentation, and you'll know because anaerobic, like without the oxygen, it's gonna smell really nasty. So to avoid that nasty smell in your yard, but in addition to have it break down more effectively, you want to put, let's say for every handful of fresh kitchen scraps, you put in 4 or 5 handfuls of something like straw or leaves. That's really gonna help you. There are so many different composting methods, and I think people get really hung up on like needing a composter or whatever. If you are gonna invest in one, I really personally, after trying several different ones, I really do recommend this kind of tumbler. This is called EnviroCycle, but I think there are a couple different brands. But basically, it's just on wheels, it's round, put your stuff in, and then once you put it in and put in your browns, you can turn it all the way around, so kind of keeps it broken down and gets that airflow. What's really great about that, particularly not if you live somewhere with things with raccoons and stuff, because that's just everywhere, but especially if you have bears, that's even more of a risk. But yeah, if you're gonna have your compost outside, and you don't want rats, raccoons, bears to become attracted to it, what you do is you put your fresh stuff in there, break it down so it gets kind of slimy and gross, and then you can transfer it to an outdoor compost heap. So it's gonna speed up the process and keep the predators or the pests out. So the old school compost heap, after trying some fancier things, or there's so many fads with composting, it's still my favorite method. And it's like, I love, working smarter, not harder. So I love kind of like what they call lazy gardening, which is not lazy at all because gardening is such hard work, but you want to like not do more manual labor than you need to, right? Or like you want things to be a little more intuitive and natural with your systems. So with the heap, which you got right here, these are our weeds that I just picked, getting our beds ready for spring planting. But anyway, you can put everything in here, and within a couple of months, it's gonna really have composted underneath. So I just take the old pitchfork, do the old pitchfork method, take off the top half, and then the bottom half is like the most beautiful broken down composted topsoil that you can put on your beds. So just with this little compost heap, we're able to, I would say, at least 2 to 3 times a year get a really good, few beds covered with this compost. So we don't generate enough, and you probably won't unless you have a big operation or a huge household. We don't generate enough to cover all of our beds every year. I think if you took additional measures to compost leaves and you had a lot of land, maybe you could do that. But we just pick a couple beds every year. So it's like, oh, okay, strawberry bed and the raspberry bed and the greens bed gets it this year. And as long as you're putting compost on, every couple years, a nice generous layer, 4 to 6 inches or something like that, that's gonna last for a while. And when you compost your own topsoil, it tends to not be like, the stuff you would order from Black Bear or Panorama. It's not gonna be like perfectly black and even. It's like there's gonna be little chunks of plants still breaking down, whatever. But I actually like that, because if you put that in your bed, it's gonna be almost like a slow release for a couple of years. And in addition, it's gonna attract all the beneficial insects, the compost critters, the bacteria, the fungi that create that network in your soil that you want. Also a reason for keeping your beds moist. Even if you don't have something planted in it, you always wanna have things mulched and moist, because if you don't, the things like the bacteria and fungi are either gonna die or go dormant, or things like the earthworms are gonna just travel deeper into the soil. So you wanna keep your top 6-inch topsoil layer really active and really healthy. And so, water is life. That's an important part. So, okay, so we talked about beds, we talked about composting, seed depth. I think that's a good nuts and bolts. Last thing is sun versus shade. Almost every fruit or vegetable that you're gonna wanna eat is gonna want full sun. With that said, there are a couple things that are more tolerant. So I would say the greens are the most tolerant. In fact, sometimes greens benefit from some shade. If it gets too hot or too bright, they can get bitter, they can bolt, you know, they can go to flower really quickly. So if you have a shadier side, plant your greens in the shade. Everything else is going to want full sun, especially if you think of it like about the energetic needs of a plant. Anything like that creates a big fruit or a lot of sugar in it, like a melon, like a pumpkin, it's getting that energy, a lot of it from the sun. So find a sunny patch. And last thing I would say is for those who don't have a good fence and want to plant something, your berry vines, at least the berry cane vines, they will do well with no fence. So blackberries, black raspberries, and raspberries are things that you can plant in a little area of your slice of paradise. So yeah, there you go. Any questions, send them my way. Any video topics in particular you'd like me to cover, go ahead and let me know. All right, guys, happy gardening.